What's going on? It's Tuesday, meaning it's the first day after the weekly reset, and we get to check out what's in our vault. Now, for those of you that aren't super familiar with how the Great Vault works, every week you can open the vault and select one item. Now, which items you can select and how many options you have are determined by the content you've done in the previous week. So in my case, because I've participated in both Raid and Mythic Plus content, I have my top 6 boxes open. If I were to have done some PvP content, then I would also gain access to the bottom 3. So I opened my vault as my main spec Assassination, and it looks kind of okay. The Myth Track chest and either of the Mythic Track shoulders are of interest. My current chest piece is a 483 item on the Hero Track, and my current shoulders are 476 item level on the Champion Track. I ended up sitting on this decision for a bit, but I eventually decide to pick up the chest piece because of the 3 extra item levels it has on it. At this point in time, I still have several pieces of gear I'm wearing that need Aspects crests to upgrade, but I'm capped by the amount of Aspects crests I can obtain on a weekly basis. So in choosing the chest piece, it frees up 15 Aspects crests I can use to upgrade something else. And I did sim both the chest and shoulders using raid bots, and it was pretty close, so ultimately I went with the chest. And after I've selected that piece, I'm awarded with a keystone. And I hinted at this before, but let me explain a little bit more about how affixes work. So affixes are this sort of flavor of the week type of mechanics that are introduced to the Mythic Plus dungeon pool. So in this case, as we can see with my plus 25 Black Hold, the affixes are Tyrannical, Incorporeal, and Spiteful. Now specifically looking at Tyrannical is sort of the opposite of Fortified, where they contrast each other, and these two affixes alternate every single week. So if one week you're doing Tyrannical, you know the next week will be Fortified, and then the opposite is true. Then regarding Incorporeal and Spiteful, these are 2 new affixes which we'll look at a little bit more once we get into the actual dungeon runs themselves, but there will always be 2 affixes that accompany Fortified or Tyrannical, and these 2 affixes are drawn from a pool of possible affixes. And with the beginning of a new Mythic Plus season, Blizzard will actually post the schedule of all of the weeks of Mythic Plus affixes. But we'll come back to this later because now we have Raid. I play with a guild that's currently progressing through Mythic Amirjasil, the current raid tier in Dragonflight. We raid Tuesday and Wednesday evenings, and we managed to kill Laradar the following day, pushing us to 6 of 9, where we'll now begin progressing on some of the bigger walls in this raid. Starting of course with Smolderon. Unfortunately, I don't manage to pick up any new gear from Raid, so the very next day we're back to Keys. This time kicking things off with a plus 24 Galakron's Fall. So I ended up running this dungeon with a couple guildmates. We queued up as a 3-pack of DPS, I believe this key was one of theirs, and looking at the first trash pool of the instance, if you remember back to the previous episode, I ended up using my Kingsbane on an ad that teleported out. So here on the opening pull, I was extra careful to ensure that the ad I sent my cooldowns on wouldn't teleport out mid-pack, but what ended up happening is that the Ripper I chose then teleported out and I didn't realize it, so I'm just standing there not attacking anything for a bit. And while I could tab target here and start attacking something else, like I could instead put my damage on the other Ripper, they tend to alternate which one teleports, so I was worried that if I sent my cooldowns on the other Ripper, that one would then teleport out towards the end of my Kingsbane. So instead, I wait for the other one to come back and then send my cooldowns on it. So we end up getting our damage out a little bit late, but I guess it's good? I don't know. But towards the end of the pull, we get a glimpse at the 2 affixes for the week. The first in the form of Spiteful. Spiteful shades will spawn from an enemy you've killed. These are mobs that will fixate on a random one of your party members and just chase after you until they die. Now they lose a % portion of their health per second, so if you leave them alone long enough, they will eventually reach 0 health and despawn, but for the time they're alive, you want to avoid getting hit by them because each melee attack hits for about half your health. So there are a few different ways you can deal with them. You can stun, CC, and slow them, or you can DPS them down. In my case as a melee, it can be a little bit awkward on these big trash pulls, trying to finish off any remaining ads while not getting melee to death by these Spitefuls, but because I play a rogue, using evasion is very strong because it allows me to dodge all of their melee attacks. So that's one of the affixes. The other affix here is Incorporeal, and the way this one works is that these 2 ads will spawn that are immune to all damage and will continue to chain cast an ability that, if it goes off, reduces all damage and healing done by 50% per stack. So if this cast goes off even once, it's likely to result in a wipe. However, this ad could be CC'd, kicked, stunned, etc. So as long as your group can coordinate CC, then these ads are not a big issue. The ads themselves last 20 seconds, so preferably your group uses long form CC that will last that duration. While shorter CC can be used in a pinch, like I can kick or stun one of these ads, that doesn't necessarily solve the mechanic because it will just begin casting after my kick or once my stun has ended. So in my case as a rogue, blind here is a really good button press since the ability blind lasts longer than 20 seconds. If I use it on one of the incorporeal mobs, my group and I can ignore that ad because it'll be CC'd for its duration. But that's the gist of it, and this dungeon goes smoothly up until the second boss, where our team again encounters issues with the chrono faded debuffs. So during this fight, our evoker ends up dying not once but twice. And to be fair, having watched this VOD back, it's hard to imagine what they could have done differently to have better survived here. So something I've recently learned on this boss is that it's very important to establish a dispel order ahead of time. This is because when a player gets the chrono faded debuff, they want to ensure they're standing in the light section. This way the AoE damage that goes out from the dispel goes out quickly and the entire party only takes one tick of this damage. But because two players get the chrono faded debuff, the player that's not getting dispelled first ideally wants to stand in the dark section because you'll take less damage standing in that zone. But because we go into this fight without any idea of who's getting dispelled when, the evoker is forced to stand in the light section in case they're the first person that gets dispelled, and in the case that they're not, they end up taking extra damage, which is unfortunately enough to kill them. Now, something I've recently started doing during this boss is if there's no dispel order clarified ahead of time, I ask to not get dispelled or be the second person that's dispelled, just so that I always know personally what I need to do during this fight. And for me, that's if I get the debuff, to pop defensives and stand in the dark section to reduce the damage that goes out when the other person gets dispelled. But here, obviously, that communication doesn't happen, and unfortunately, our evoker goes down. Now, something that can help that I've recently learned is that, at least of the healers I've talked to, if your healer is one of the people with the debuff, they will always dispel themselves first. Now, I don't know if every healer does this, but the reason for it is that if you have the power to dispel people and you have the debuff, you know when you're in a good spot to do that dispel, so it makes sense for you to be the first person to do that dispel, especially if you're playing with pugs, because you can't always trust that they will be in the right spot for the dispel, especially if you want to get the dispel off quickly. So if you happen to be in a situation where the healer has the debuff and you have the other debuff, I think it's safe to expect that the healer will dispel themselves first, but take it with a slight grain of salt, and it's always better to clarify ahead of time what the dispel order will be. Also, as a side note, you see me often moving here on the dispels. This is bad, I should be planted. If I'm moving in the wrong direction, I have a chance of getting double ticked by the AoE that goes out, and that just happens when you're running away from the dispel. Possible to register multiple hits and take damage multiple times from that one dispel. So stay planted. But we take down Manifested Timeways and make our way to the third boss. And this is where, during the Blade of Galakron, some weird stuff goes down. During phase 1, our healer gets the corrosion debuff and has to pass it to our tank. First off, I want you to notice the difficult path they have to our tank. Both our warlock and evoker are like in the way of the healer trying to get to the tank. So our monk has to dodge weave their way to the tank in order to clear the debuff. And as they're making their way over, the monk ends up running into the green stuff on the ground, and it looks like the monk runs through the tank, but I guess the monk just slightly missed the tank and the debuff doesn't pass, and then the monk goes down. We do have battle res, so we pick them back up, but it was definitely a bit of a weird start. And then once we transitioned into phase 3, the monk dies once again to an unplanned corrosion jump. The monk had the debuff and passed to the tank. Then shortly afterwards, the monk and tank end up running into each other, which means the tank passes the debuff off to the monk and the monk goes down. Now in this phase, it is normal for the tank to need to pass the debuff off to somebody else multiple times because the frontal that clears the debuff doesn't come out for a while. But in this case, the tank gave the debuff back like right away, which definitely looked accidental. And with the monk dying a second time, we slowly run out. However, this key's timer is very forgiving, so we run it back a second time. This time around, I died during phase 1 to some very weird camera angles and movement. I set my 2-minute cooldowns on the boss, so I'm trying to ramp that damage just as a set of swirlies go out. So I run to avoid the swirlies, but then the tank moves the boss and I'm out of range. So I go to follow the boss and run back into a swirly and end up dying. This definitely felt really crummy in the moment, especially since it was during my cooldowns that I lost a lot of damage here, but we did have one available battle res, so my team was able to get me back up. And then as we're transitioning into phase 3, the monk gets meleeed and dies. So I've heard of this being a thing. Apparently if you run into attack the boss early, you can just randomly get auto attacked. And so I've kind of developed a habit to stay out of melee until the two bosses have spawned, but I hadn't actually seen it for myself up until this point, and unfortunately we don't have any available battle reses, so we're unable to kill a boss without a healer, and that ends up being a depleted key. So we run back the 23 and encounter a lot of the same issues we had in the 24. The first part of the dungeon goes smoothly up until Manifested Timeways, where we still don't know who's getting dispelled first, so I end up dying standing in the light section because the other person gets dispelled first, and Faint on its own isn't enough to keep me alive. The combination of the dispel plus my death is a lot of damage, and it ends up also killing the healer and evoker, but at this point in the dungeon we still have 2 battle reses, so we're able to pick up both the healer and myself and finish the fight with the 4 of us. We move on then to Blight of Galkrond, and in phase 2 our healer gets the corrosion debuff, stands at a swirly, and dies. We don't have battle res and we're not going to be able to finish this fight down a healer, so we wipe and go again. The next pull then proceeds somewhat hilariously because during phase 1 our warlock gets the corrosion debuff and goes to pass it off to the tank, but our druid, the healer, is standing in the way. So the warlock goes to run around the druid. At the same time that the druid tries to get out of the way, they end up doing a bit of a dance before the warlock ends up passing it accidentally to the druid, at which point the tank needs to clear because the frontal's going out, so the tank tries to hunt down the druid as the druid's running away and ends up killing the druid with the frontal. We again don't have battle res, so it's on to attempt 3. This time around we're able to reach phase 3 without any deaths, but the tank is forced to pass the debuff off to another player to avoid being mind controlled. They happen to pick the closest target to the evoker, who I guess wasn't prepared for it, and they end up dying as a result. But luckily we do have our 3rd battle res come up, so we're able to pick them back up and finish the fight. The rest of the dungeon then goes off without a hitch, and we're able to complete the key despite having 2 full wipes, which is kinda crazy, and it goes to show that the timer in this place is super forgiving. Then completing this key gets us 6 additional Mythic Plus score, and afterwards I decided to run my plus 25 Black or Cold with some other friends, and we again queue it up as a 3-pack of DPS. I seem to lack friends that also happen to be tanks and healers, so that might be something that needs to change. But we're able to pick up both a healer and tank and send the Black or Cold. Now this dungeon is super fun to play as Assassination, because there are many pulls with 1 to 2 high health mobs accompanied by several low health adds. These types of pulls are perfect for my damage profile, and I managed to push just over 1.2 million DPS on one of these Fel Dominators, getting ample pad from the surrounding bats. And the run itself goes super smooth, or at least up until the final boss, which turns out to be quite exciting, because Stain Swarm causes some serious issues for our group. The boss will always target one of your DPS players, and the first player he targets happens to be our Hunter. Now Hunters are known for being one of the more squishy classes in Mythic Plus, and the first time they get picked here, I imagine they have some defensive available that they use. The priest also drops a barrier, so we're able to heal the Hunter and DPS the ad down. Then next I get picked. Now, at this point in time, I'm still playing cheat death, and what that means is that there is basically nothing I can use to mitigate the damage dealt by this ad, which is bad because it means I'm very squishy. And this seems to be something a bit different this season, which is that at higher key levels, you're almost forced to play elusiveness, which is the alternative to cheat death, because without it, you just aren't able to survive the majority of boss mechanics, especially on Tyrannical weeks. Things hit very hard. So when I get picked next here, I don't really have anything I can press, but luckily the Paladin bops me, which removes the ad, so this one's a non-issue. Next then, the Warrior gets picked. Now I actually don't know how tanky or squishy DPS warriors are this season. I know they have access to Spell Reflect, which gets big value on this boss since they're casting Shadow Bolt Volley every like 10 seconds or so, but they managed to live just fine. We DPS the ad down, no issues so far. And then our Hunter gets picked again, and I guess at this point they don't have any defenses left, so they die pretty fast. We do have battle res, so we pick them up, but then next I get picked, and as mentioned before, I don't have a lot of defensives I can use to survive. I press evasion thinking maybe I can dodge the hits from the ad. Turns out you can't. It takes my health away real quick, proccing my cheat death. I health pot, and the healer manages to top me off, and we kill the ad before it kills me, but our healer then dies to the next Shadow Ball Volley. I guess they tunnel visioned me trying to keep me alive and wasn't paying attention to their own health bar. So now we don't have a healer, we make it to the intermission, but all the DPS have like no health. And I thought we had a battle res here, but it turns out we didn't. So we dodge lines and make it out of the intermission. Our Hunter then gets picked by Singing Storm next, and with the healer dead, he falls over. And shortly afterwards, I'm about to die just as we're getting a new set of incorporeal spawns. So just before I go down, I toss out my blind on one of the incorporeals, which ends up being super big because the prop paladin's able to get a battle res off on the healer and has enough time to use turn evil on the other incorporeal. And while all this is happening, our warrior was then picked by Singing Swarm, healer still isn't alive, so they go down. But we've done enough, and our tank and healer are able to finish the fight, and we limp across the finish line, granting us 15 additional Mythic Plus score, and turning my key into a plus 26 Throne of the Tides. At this point, however, I thought a plus 26 throne seemed a little ambitious, so the three of us decided to run the same dungeon, but using the Hunter's Key at a plus 23 level. So Throne of the Tides is a dungeon I haven't yet showcased in this series, so while this would be a good opportunity to go through this key, it actually goes remarkably well, and so there isn't a whole lot of drama to cover, and the Hunter ends up pulling out 400k overall, vastly out DPSing me, where most of the pulls in the dungeon go like what you're seeing here, where everything is already dead by the time I'm actually in my cooldowns. I guess because it's a Tyrannical week, at a plus 23 level, the trash just doesn't live long enough for me to finish my pre-ramp. So something I could have done to adjust for how quickly the trash was dying would be to get into my cooldown window quicker, skipping parts of the pre-ramp. Because while my pre-ramp enables my cooldowns to do the most possible damage, if all of the mobs are dead by the time I'm pressing those cooldowns, I'm losing value. So something needs to give, and in my opinion, it's what comes before my cooldowns. Take this with a grain of salt, however, because as we move to higher key levels, mobs have larger health pools, and ultimately the best form of my damage includes my full pre-ramp. So this particular key may be an exception and doesn't apply to all dungeons at all key levels. So I get it, the Hunter absolutely crushed me. Let's move on to the next dungeon. The Timed Throne turned into a plus 24 Darkheart Thicket, which we decided to jump into. And despite it being a Tyrannical week, most of the issues with this run actually come during the trash. And more specifically, if we jump to the third trash pull of the instance, we do a double pull with multiple casters, Nightclaws, and a Poisoner. Now there's a lot of party-wide damage going out during this pack, with the many Nightclaws jumping on random players, applying a permanent bleed that only gets removed when the player's health is topped. You can see I end up getting the debuff. That, in addition to getting hit by a couple other things, causes my cheat death to proc, and while I do eventually get my health topped off, our healer ends up going down, and without the healer, we don't have a way to survive this damage. So the rest of our DPS end up dying off one by one, and then as part of our groups running back, a set of incorporeal beings spawn, and we don't have a way to deal with them, resulting in a cast going through. Now the tank does manage to stay alive here and keep the pull going, so at the very least the mob's health don't reset, but it's more or less a full wipe. Then moving on to the first boss here, I mentioned before that I find positioning as a melee DPS to be very awkward during this encounter, and I end up dying towards the end of the fight because I just don't know where to stand. And as a result, I end up getting hit by Grievous Leap. I suppose when the boss jumped away, I could have ran away myself, but I was too slow to react and I end up getting hit. Then on the very next trash pack following this boss, I then stand on the edge of a swirly and die. To be fair, I did think I was outside the hitbox, but apparently not. Anyways, we make our way to the trash before the second boss, where a Dryad is just chilling in the back, picking our players off one by one. Our Evoker ends up going down, followed by the Hunters shortly afterwards. For this reason, Dryads are usually a DPS priority in the sense that we want to kill them as fast as possible, and pulling other packs together with the Dryads is usually difficult because the Dryads will disengage and are difficult to group up. I think what might have been better as the tank here is to have not pulled the next pack until the Dryad was dead because of the issues it caused us. Then after this trash pull, we have a couple more one-off deaths on the remaining bosses, but otherwise the rest of the key goes off without much of note, and we end up completing the key with just under 2 minutes to spare, granting us plus 6 additional Mythic Plus rating. And that actually ends up being our final key done until the following reset. This batch of keys was recorded just before the holidays, so unfortunately I wasn't able to put any more time into my rogue, at least beyond what you've seen so far. So while today's episode has been a bit shorter, be sure to tune in next time because the following week we put our nose to the grindstone and absolutely slam. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. But if you've enjoyed so far, consider dropping a like and subscribing, really helps me out and I appreciate the support. Otherwise, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.